I don't have much of a force. I only have 10 troopers, including myself, and 6 local yokel deputy dogs. Yeah, it's what I'm talking about. We're flying completely blind here, and I need to know what's going on with Hines and Brown. They're good men. Split your people. Leave half to man your perimeter and take the rest with you. Remember, try to keep contact at a minimum. And also, everyone needs a mask. I'm talking a real mask. The state police only had gloves and surgical masks, neither of which engendered much of a sense of protection. They would have to borrow gear from the emergency units. Foster snorted. The EMTs and the firetards won't be happy. Pemberton didn't care if they were happy or not. If anyone won't give up their equipment, deputize them and make them come with you inside. This had Foster chuckling. He knew that not one of them would come along. He didn't question their courage. He only knew they had the courage of backcountry emergency workers who were accustomed to cleaning up after car crashes, wetting down a burning house every once in a while, and dealing with assorted felines stuck up in trees. Then there were the parades and school functions that had to be attended. And of course they had to make time to strut about to the local gals whose bodies were like soft boulders, and who saw a man in uniform less as a heroic figure, but rather a man most likely to conform. Foster had known many of these country emergency workers. They wore their uniforms much the way a peacock wears his feathers. They would fold them in the second things got rough. He wasn't wrong. The locals huffed and puffed, staging hysterics strictly for each other's benefit. But when push came to shove and he threatened to deputize them, they handed over their equipment just like that. While the emergency personnel began hauling out the protective hazmat suits, Foster looked over the men he had to work with. He decided to go with size as his main criteria. From many years of experience, he knew that even people who were high or tripping or drunk usually respected a man if he was big enough. For this reason, he chose 4 of his troopers and the 3 sheriff's deputies from Middleton, who were huge, both in weight and girth. He chose incorrectly. Middleton had not yet made it into the 21st century. The 3 deputies had .38 caliber police specials on their hips, meaning that after 6 shots, they'd be dry. Worse, not a one of them had ever reloaded their pissant little pistols under pressure, nor had they trained to do so. In their sleepy little burgs, there had never really been a reason to. "Let's get buttoned up," Foster barked. Under the watchful eye of the emergency workers, the 8 men donned the protective gear. Foster was so concerned over the thought of germs and the integrity of the suit that he didn't realize that he had safely encased his weapon in plastic. It was germ-free, but useless otherwise. "Shit," Trooper Eddie Peels said when he realized the problem. "Our guns!" Some of the EMTs started chuckling while the troopers all looked at Foster. Peels asked, "Is it too late? Do we leave them where they're at?" Foster felt the ache of time getting by. However, he wasn't about to go up against crazed, infected cannibals without a gun at the ready. "Let's get them out." None of the men made a fuss. As the men struggled out of their suits, Foster went over what he expected to encounter. "We've all read about people on bath salts, and some of us have had run-ins with people on PCP and meth. Supposedly what's going on with the people in there is worse. So if we have to take any of them down, we do it hard and fast." The men grunted or nodded, thinking they knew the score already. When they were ready, Foster formed them up, making sure to put the 3 Middleton men to his left where he could keep an eye on them. He led the way, sweeping through the abandoned gates and advancing on the brightly lit hospital. Rain pattered on their plastic hoods and coursed down their plastic suits in tiny rivers. It streaked across their face shields, making them even more unrecognizable to each other. Foster knew the Middleton boys because their gun belts were different, and because one of them had foolishly pinned his deputy badge to the outside of his biosuit. His own troopers were strange, alien-looking blobs with guns at their sides. "Hold!" Foster barked as they came upon the CBC van. He glanced in, expecting to see only a corpse. It should have been a corpse. The man lying across the front seats looked as though a lion had gorged itself on his intestines. He was torn open across the middle. Blood was everywhere, spattering the glass and the console and soaking into the seat cushions. Still, he wasn't dead. Damon turned his head ever so slowly to stare at Foster. He started gnashing his teeth. "He's trying to say something," Foster said, waving his gloved hand to quiet the troopers who were gathered around. "Step back." Foster opened the door. "It'll be all right, sir. Don't try to move. Just lay back." Damon had turned on his side and was trying to kill, but he was too weak, and Foster ignored the hand scraping at his plastic biosuit. He also ignored the black goo dripping from Damon's eyes and nose, mistaking it for old blood. "Just settle down and try to tell me what happened." Damon snapped his teeth and groaned in hunger and frustration. "Can you hear me?" Foster asked, holding the man's hands down. "He ain't hearing shit, Sarge," one of the troopers said. That was true enough. Damon was solely focused on reaching Foster with his teeth and tearing out his throat. To the troopers, he seemed so far gone that he didn't appear to be much of a threat. "Paul?" Foster asked. "Which one of you?" "Right here," one of the alien blobs said. Jared Paul had been 3 years into a medical degree before he grew bored with school and traded in his books for a gun. Paul squinted from behind his face shield at Damon. "There's pretty much nothing I can do for him." "Stay with him," Foster said, weakening his crew. "It's not right to leave someone alone to die like that." Now it was only 7 men who advanced on the looming hospital. At the front doors, Foster pulled his weapon. The others followed suit. Just through the glass, he could see the body of a state trooper. The face was too torn up to be recognized. There were 3 other visible living beings walking around the lobby. They didn't look right either. They looked like they should have been dead too. "Let's go," Foster said. One of the troopers opened the doors for the others. The 7 rushed in, guns leveled, and began to fan out. Foster stopped at the trooper's body. There was no need to check for a pulse. "Who is it?" one of the troopers asked. "Wendell Brown," Foster replied. The corpse's face had been eaten off, but his name tag was shiny and looked new. "Shit," the trooper said. "Yeah," Foster agreed, in a whisper that didn't make it through the respiratory filters on his suit. There was little time to mourn. "We got incoming," one of the Middleton boys hissed. 2 people were shambling at them. They were horrors. Blank faces, black eyes, wide, gaping mouths. "That's the disease?" someone off to Foster's right asked. "What is it, Legionnaires?" "It's not Legionnaires." Foster had arrested a junkie who somehow contracted Legionnaires. Whatever this was, it was far worse. He held up his free hand. "Stop where you are." "I said stop, or we'll be forced to take... Shit, take him down!" The pair, Anita DeSoto, one of the recently deceased cafeteria workers, and Mr. Mumford, charged straight at the law enforcement officers, ignoring the 7 guns pointing their way. Neither of them was large, but both were surprisingly strong and vicious, using their teeth as weapons. They weren't subtle about it. They led with their mouths open and snarling. The troopers were not caught unaware, but still, it took 2 men to wrestle each down to the ground, and a third to actually cuff them. "That was crazy," one of the troopers said. He was breathing heavily, and a fog kept wisping across his mask with every other breath. The 7 stood over Mumford and DeSoto, watching as they bucked and grunted, trying to get at the living in spite of the cuffs pinning their arms behind their backs. "Check your suits for any rips or tears," Foster ordered. Their suits, though streaked with the infectious black mold, were whole and intact. "What do we do with them?" asked the Middleton deputy who had pinned his star to his chest. He had been in the thick of it, struggling with Mr. Mumford, and now he was taking in spores through those twin holes every time he sucked in a breath. "We leave them for now and get them on the way back," Foster answered. He too had been surprised at the ferocity of the 2 rather small and unassuming individuals, and he wasn't about to further weaken his crew by leaving someone to watch over them. "Let's take this floor room by room, nice and slow. The troopers will have point, the deputies will watch us 6. "Wait, where did the other one go?" one of the Middleton boys asked. "There was a 3rd dude. Where'd he go?" Everyone craned their heads around, trying to see out of the little clear windows in their masks. Other than the twitching body of Earl the security guard, there wasn't anyone around. "Forget about him," Foster said. "If he's anything like these 2, he'll show himself sooner or later." 2. Von Braun wasn't like Anita or Mr. Mumford, at least not yet. He still had 3 bags of diazepam left. 3 bags to find the cure, he whispered. After Hines had cracked his sternum and he had been trampled by the admin workers rushing up the stairs, Von Braun had wandered into the lobby, breathing like a broken accordion. His one thought was of revenge. He decided he would gather an army of his own and take the cure from that fuckwad of a cop. The only problem was that the lobby was practically empty, with only 2 morons wandering around. He tried to gather them to his cause, but they kept wandering off, and soon he became confused as well. His brain was a mush of hate. There were simply too many people he wanted to hurt. The cop, the gook, the nigger, and there were others. He remembered, barely, that his lawyer had been an asshole who had to die. And then there was Johnny Carew from the 5th grade. I gotta kill that fucker too. There were more, and Von Braun found himself staring at the distant flashing lights of 24 emergency vehicles as he dwelled on all those he wanted to kill with his bare hands. The lights captivated him, and like a deer in the headlights, he stood at the tall windows that made up the walls of the lower floor and simply stared. Von Braun gazed blankly through the glass doors until he heard the explosion on the top floor that rattled the building. Then he stared upwards for a full minute before a thought blinked into his brain. My cure! With the black goo draining from the ducts in his eyes, running was difficult. He stumbled like a drunk over Mr. Mumford and Anita and began to shepherd them to the stairs. They were annoyingly slow and easily distracted. They didn't understand that the cure was in danger. In fact, it seemed to Von Braun they didn't understand anything. Get up there, you fat fuck! He screamed at Mr. Mumford, pointing at the stairs where the smell of burnt flesh was overpowering. Had it been clean flesh, Von Braun would have left the two and run to gorge himself, but the flesh had the underlying stink of shit, which made his stomach turn. Mumford hesitated in the doorway, growled, and then scratched at his eyes, tearing off a piece of his eyebrow. Anita turned away. Von Braun was thinking of killing her when he caught movement through the glass doors. The police were coming. There were so many of them, too many for him to count, but not so many that they couldn't be overcome. Go get them, he said, turning Mumford around. Mumford didn't need to be told twice. His brain was a black hole of misery. However, he knew fresh meat when he saw it. He and Anita went after Foster's little force, and Von Braun went for reinforcements. In the little wedge of gray matter that was still operating, he knew it would take lots of his kind to bring down so many cops. His stomach rumbled hungrily, thinking about it. As he climbed the stairs, he encountered others, and he turned them around to point down the stairs, yelling into their ears, "The police are down there! Go get them!" He sent a constant stream down. When he reached the 4th floor, he came on a dozen beings that no longer looked human. Their skin was black and ragged. Their skulls burned down to the bone, but still they pressed onto the door and beat at it with hands that were little more than fused bone. Von Braun tried to get them to go after the police as well, but they could smell the fresh meat of the scientists, and nothing was going to dissuade them from getting through the door. Von Braun went back down to the 3rd floor, rounded up another 20 or so, and sent them downwards. They had been feeding on the newly killed. The 6 people trapped in the CAT scan room, not understanding the breadth of the problem, had tried to make a break for it. They hadn't got far. Von Braun paused only long enough to take a bite from Dr. Hester's lukewarm corpse. The meat wasn't hot, which meant it wasn't good. Spitting it out, he went to the south stair and began pushing more of the zombies toward the 1st floor. It was then that the first gunshots began to rattle the air. "Hurry, fuckers!" he screamed at the slow-moving zombies. "There won't be anything left!" All told, 80 infected people were heading for the 7 officers. 3. The troopers were surveying the bloodbath in the 1st floor break room when the first of the infected people broke out into the lobby and began wandering around. They could smell fresh meat, but they couldn't pinpoint where the sweet odor was coming from. With their hoods stifling sound and cutting off their peripheral vision, the troopers were oblivious to them. Foster was very glad for the concealing plastic. Yes, it kept the germs out, but it also hid the fact from the others that he had gone a shade of green. He had never been to any crime scene that was comparable to what lay in front of him. It was more than just the blood. All over the floor were ugly hunks of flesh, long strands of hair still anchored to flaps of scalp, and a number of fingers. He counted 8, but no thumbs. There were also 7 bodies, only one of which was actually dead. The rest were like the CDC man in the van, mostly dead. Most had been torn apart by something with vicious teeth and an eternal hunger, but a few sported gaping holes caused by a 9mm handgun. "Where's the rest of them?" one of the Middleton boys asked. "Maybe Hines is trapped upstairs," Foster answered. The deputy shook his head. "No, I meant, where are the rest of the dead?" He pointed at the ground. Amid the blood and pieces of stray body parts were 39 brass casings. Foster stared all around, realizing that the deputy was right. The numbers weren't adding up. With so many shots taken, there should have been a couple of dozen bodies. Something caught his eye. There had been so much blood that he hadn't noticed it before. "Drag marks," he said, indicating the floor where black streaks ran through the red. The color didn't make sense, but he had seen the telltale marks of a body having been dragged away enough times to know what they were. They followed them out into the admin area to the nearest cubicle, fully expecting to see a pile of corpses. Instead, there were just 2, again, grasping, half-dead creatures that made their stomachs churn. "It looks like they just walked off," someone said. "How? How do you get shot up and then walk away like it was nothing?" "And where did they walk off to?" another asked, quietly. The men were more like frightened boys. They clumped together, facing outward, ready to shoot the nearest shadow if it looked menacing enough. "We should have waited for the CDC, a deputy said. "We should have sat tight like the rules say. Shut your fucking lip!" Foster snapped. "We still have a man in this building, not to mention there are civilians trapped upstairs. Now let's do our fucking jobs." There was an embarrassed silence broken when one of the deputies said, "Sir, there's more of them." Attracted by Sergeant Foster's yelling, 3 zombies had come snooping around. One was Lacey Freeman. The pistol she had taken from Rory Vickers was long forgotten. Her meds had run out, and now all she knew was hate and hunger. The 3 saw the strange plastic-covered figures and grew confused, not being able to juxtapose the sound of human voices with what their blurred vision showed. They advanced slowly, until Foster said, "Take them, 2 per individual. Concentrate on pinning them first and cuffing them second. I don't want anyone bitten." The officers knew what to expect this time, and the takedown went smoothly. The 3 were trussed up with only a little bit of fuss, and then the 7 officers stood around looking down at them. One of his troopers said, "My visor keeps getting fogged up. Is that normal?" "Mine too," someone agreed. "I think you should be worried if it wasn't," Foster told them. "It just means our suits are airtight. That's a good thing." He wanted to reassure them and himself. He had begun to sweat, and, like the others, every breath sent a fog across his vision. "Maybe we should take a moment to relax before we head up. Smoke 'em if you got 'em." There was only one trooper with a nicotine addiction. "I would if I could," Trooper Bauer said. "You think I can take a drag through these filters?" "I think you could." Foster stopped in mid-sentence. From the lobby, another dozen or so zombies walked into the cubicled admin area. Sudden fear gripped him, and instinctively he dropped into a crouch. The others took one look and hunkered down as well. "What do we do?" one of the Middleton men asked, his quivering voice at odds with his size. We... Hold on, let me think," Foster said. His greatest fear was of the germs, turning into one of them. However, he was also extremely afraid of making a mistake. It was the age of blame and lawsuits, where every action was scrutinized later so that a sacrificial lamb could be produced whenever something really big happened. This is what had him nervous. Not for a second did Foster consider the possibility of being eaten alive. He peeked over the metalled edge of the cubicle and studied the people for a few seconds. "They're like the others. Whatever happened to them has messed up their minds, which means they'll come in stupid. I saw a printing room while we were coming in. I say we use it to funnel them in at us one at a time. We zip tie them and clear the floor that way." Awkwardly in their plastic hoods, they all agreed to the plan. Foster led the way. It was all of 40 yards to the printing room, but they stopped after only making half that distance. There were a lot more zombies than they had realized. The first floor was teeming with them. "Go back!" Foster said, urgently. It was already too late. There were black-eyed creatures in front and behind, and worse, they'd been spotted. One of the zombies in a hospital gown let out a hiss and charged. This brought on a full stampede of the infected. "Run!" someone yelled. 2 of the officers took off in different directions. Another officer, with a zombie bearing down on him, fired his weapon twice in quick succession, dropping it at his feet. "Stop!" cried Foster to the fleeing troopers. One kept going, racing at top speed to who knew where. The other's mask fogged over at the wrong moment. He tripped over a chair that had been sticking out of a cubicle and went down hard. 3 zombies attacked him, throwing themselves on him with their jaws gaping. Coming to a split-second decision, Foster yelled, "Quick, follow me!" He ran to the downed man and at first tried to do the humane thing. He kicked a horrible black-eyed woman full in the face with his boot. Teeth and blood flew. Still, she clawed and bit at the prone trooper. Next, he used his gun and shot her in the spine. Her legs went jelly, but her hands continued to tear at the plastic, and her mouth reached his abdomen, where she began to rend through the plastic and into his flesh. Foster grabbed her by the collar of her shirt and hauled her back. One of the troopers fired into her chest twice at point-blank range, and she slumped. Meanwhile, gunshots were going off all over the place. The downed trooper was firing up at his 2 other attackers without regard to anything but saving his own ass. Bullets passed through them and around them, and a couple came within an inch of hitting Foster. He didn't notice. He had his own zombies to worry about. 6 were charging in a line in front of him, and he completely forgot his fear of getting in trouble. He began firing as quickly as his finger could pull the trigger. The other officers were emptying their weapons into the advancing horde with very little effect. If one fell after absorbing the impact of 5 or 6 rounds, another took its place. For the span of half a minute, the 2 groups fought to a draw, and then the Middleton deputies were forced to reload as their guns ran dry. Reloading with gloved hands and fogged-over masks was impossible in the second or 2 they had to work with. First, one was bowled over, then the other 2 were gang-rushed a moment later. They were swarmed under a pile of zombies. Foster and the other trooper tried to help. They shot into the mass until their guns emptied as well. Foster fumbled for a full magazine, dropping it. He didn't try to grab it from the ground. It was too late for the deputies, and maybe even too late for him and the remaining troopers. There were just too many zombies, too close, coming from every angle. "Run!" he yelled, grabbing the one standing trooper and pulling him along. Foster dodged between 2 zombies and ran along a corridor of cubicles until his path was cut off by 3 more of the walking horrors. He dodged to the right, jumped up onto a desk, and then leapt a cubicle wall. He didn't quite make it, and the wall came crashing down. He landed on the desk in the next cubicle and was up and running before he could draw a breath. He ran low, keeping below the walls of the cubicles. At one of the little corridors, he paused to check behind him for the trooper whom he'd grabbed. The man was nowhere to be seen. There were gunshots from 3 directions, and zombies everywhere. Foster's courage failed him, and for once in his career, he ran from the sounds of the guns. He ran for the lobby, where he stopped in dread. There were dozens of the creatures between him and the exit. His breath began to race, clouding his mask completely. "Oh, fuck," he whined, digging for a new magazine from the holder at his belt. One slid from his grip and clinked on the linoleum. The next felt turned around and wrong. It wouldn't seem to fit into his gun. With the fog obscuring his vision, he was blind and afraid, and all around him, the growls of the creatures grew louder as they closed in. Finally, he couldn't take the terror that was building in him, and he ripped off the hood and mask so that he could see his death approaching. It was very close. The zombies were just feet away. The gun went ignored. Now that he could see, Foster sprinted away faster than he thought possible, leaving the beasts and the last of his troopers far behind. He dodged in and among the zombies, and when he came up to the lobby doors, he pulled them closed behind him, and then backed away from the glass, still trying to get the damned clip into his pistol. The zombies rushed up to the windows and stopped. The smell of sweetmeat had suddenly diminished, and the man they'd been chasing had, at least in their eyes, disappeared. All they could see was themselves reflected in the glass. Gulping in the cool, wet air, Foster realized he was safe. He had lived! A twisted smile trembled his lips for all of a moment before he remembered his troopers. There was no sign of them, save for a lone scream that barely reached his ears. It was an awful, painful sound that went right to his soul, twisting it into a gnarly, foul knot that made his chest ache. His hand shook as he tried to load the magazine into his pistol. Finally, it clicked into place, and then he thought, now what? Loaded gun or not, he knew there was no way he was going back in. But it hardly mattered. The scream ended in a high screech. No, Foster said, stepping forward. He couldn't bring himself to go further. In fact, the accusing silence had him backing away again until his foot stumbled on the curb and he plopped onto his ass with a grunt. The fall jarred him into a version of reality. He holstered the gun, and then as quick as he could, he pulled the plastic hood and mask back over his face. I'm okay, he said, making sure everything was back in place. I'm fine. He took a deep breath as if to prove the point. Having convinced himself that he hadn't been near enough to any of the infected people to get their disease, he began to worry on his second greatest fear. He had royally screwed up. 6 dead officers meant he'd screwed up worse than anything he could have imagined. I was just following orders, he whispered. This was Pemberton's fault. Excuses began to click through his mind. He'd been ordered into the building. Not his fault. He'd been ambushed. Again, not his fault. The masks were faulty and kept fogging up. That was the fire department's fault. The Middleton boys were equipped with crappy little 6-shooters. That was Middleton's fault. In the middle of this, a voice spoke right in his ear. What the hell happened in there? Foster actually screamed. It was Trooper Paul, the man he had left behind to watch over the CDC zombie. It sounded like a friggin' war in there, Paul went on. We were ambushed, Foster jabbered. They were everywhere. They eat people. Paul stepped back, trying to size up his sergeant through the little plastic window in his suit. Foster's eyes were huge and unblinking. He was pale as fish belly and was dripping sweat down the inside of his suit. In a word, he looked crazy. Gently, Paul asked, Who wants to eat people? The sergeant's eyes went to slits at the question, realizing he wouldn't be believed. Not yet, at least. The infected people. The cannibals. They can't be stopped. You'll see. When they get out, you'll see. The idea of them getting out was deeply unsettling. There were just so many of them. Forgetting Paul, Foster started to head back to his cruiser, which doubled as his command post. He looked back over his shoulder every few steps, afraid the zombies had gotten out and were after him again. Paul stood for a moment, confused and worried. He then jogged to catch up. But what about everyone else? Where are the others? He asked. Foster stopped short. He was the only one left alive. How was he possibly going to explain that? He'd been the leader. Leaders weren't supposed to be the first one out the door. They were supposed to be the last. Who would understand that he'd ran because he'd been without any other option? Who could possibly understand the truth about what had really happened? They'd have to see it for themselves. The dead, sort of. The strange answer and the queer look on Foster's face had Paul thinking it was best not to ask any more questions. Foster knew he sounded crazy. He felt crazy. You'll see. And then you won't look at me like you are with your judging eyes. You'll see. 4. Anna! Twee whispered as loudly as she dared. As logical as she was, after the terrors she'd faced that day, the dark elevator shaft seemed as though it could hold endless evil. Anna! If you can hear me, say something or tap the wall! Anna! The dark was mute and deep. So deep that Twee felt she could scream into it at the top of her lungs, and her voice wouldn't carry to its furthest depths. She was on her stomach, staring down, straining her ears to hear the slightest sound. There was nothing, not even an echo. She must have fallen, Deckard said. He was standing over Twee, noting that her long black hair so matched the darkness of the elevator shaft that she looked to be melding with the shadows. It was strangely enticing. She must have fallen? Twee snapped. Is that right? You sure she didn't grow wings and fly away? So much for enticing. Deckard's eye went hard. Okay, you trapped her, left her hanging in the dark, and then she must have fallen. Better? It wasn't, since it was true. She was guilty of killing Anna. That was the truth. Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. This is my fault. She's dead because of me. And we're alive because of you, Deckard said. You made a choice, a good one if you ask me. It doesn't feel good. Twee stood up, the toes of her shoes hanging off the edge. I need to get a lantern or a torch. I can take some of the wiring from the... She stopped at Deckard's sharp look. We have to do something, Deckard. We can't just leave her down there. What if she's hurt? She could be down there with a serious brain injury. And what if she is? I could climb down there, but what then? I'm not a brain surgeon. Dr. Wilson is the closest thing, but I don't know if he could make the climb. And even if he could, he doesn't have any supplies. If you ask me if she's knocked out, we might consider her lucky. She's missing out on all of this. Twee didn't want to be so easily dissuaded. It made the guilt clogging her chest swell. Okay, so we don't go down. At least not yet. But I can still fashion a light that we can lower. Below them, Foster and his state troopers had just discovered that they were surrounded. The sound of their gunfire rippled through the building, and everyone stopped what they were doing to listen. This wasn't like when Hines and Brown had fired their weapons earlier. From the fourth floor, it sounded like there was a platoon of soldiers blasting everything in sight. It lasted barely a minute, and then there was silence. Was that the police or the army? Twee asked. The police, Deckard said, checking his watch. It's about time, too. Wait here, I need to make sure Milner isn't getting happy feet over this and breaking quarantine. Twee didn't wait. If the police were here, it meant the CDC had finally arrived, and there were plenty of things to do before they showed up. She went to the first of the BSL-3 labs, where everyone had gathered after the fight on the stairs. I need someone to get in touch with the police again, she said as she strode through the glass door. Dr. Riggs jumped up. Did you hear all the shooting? That means we're being rescued, right? All of the other scientists looked at her expectantly, their excitement plain on their faces. It seems to be a safe assumption, Twee answered. But that doesn't mean we can rush out of here just yet. There are protocols that must be followed. Like I said, I need someone to call the police. I don't want them barging up here if they've come in contact with any of the infected people. Also, we should ask for hazmat suits for each of us before we exit this floor. Riggs, put Milner up to it. It'll give him something to do. The rest of you need to gather up all the information we have on the comm cells. Any printouts, notes, blood samples, what have you. The CDC will want to see all of it. The scientists rushed to the shambles that had been their workstations and began to make piles out of the mess. Most of them were grinning at the prospect of rescue. Before she left to arrange her own notes, she went to see Chuck, Burke, and Stephanie. They were tired and pale, less excited than the others. Their being rescued only meant their deaths had been put off for another month or two. Twee dropped down onto her knees in front of where they sat. I need help with something. Anna fell while we were busy fending off the She caught herself just in time. Unfortunately, the word zombie seemed to fit so well. I mean, while we were fending off the infected persons. There are no sounds coming from the elevator shaft, but I want to make sure Anna isn't down there hurt and all alone. Y'all want us to climb down that bitch? Burke asked. No, if you don't mind, could you sit by the shaft and listen for her? She's down there because of me. Chuck snorted. That's not the way I reckon the score. She's down there on account of what she did. She made her bed, and I figure she's lying in it now. I'll stay with her, Stephanie said. I made you leave her there. It's my fault, too. Chuck went along with Stephanie because of the feelings he had for her, and Burke went along with Chuck because he was uncomfortable around the egghead scientists. The three sat about, talking death. Mayhap getting bit by one of them zombies ain't the worst thing in the world, Burke said. Y'all seen them burned up ones same as me. They can't die is all I'm saying. That's something. Stephanie couldn't get with the idea of becoming one of them. However, Chuck agreed with Burke. Supposedly they can be sedated, get put into a coma. That wouldn't be so bad. You just lie there until they find a cure, and then... He snapped his fingers. You wake up good as new. And if they can't find a cure? Stephanie asked. Then you'll never know, Chuck answered. I'm not saying I'm going to let myself get bit. I'm just saying it's an option for when we're out of here. In the last couple of weeks, I've been enjoying life more than ever, and I kind of want to keep it going if I can. 5. Sir, you have to remain patient, Courtney said in her practiced bored-as-hell voice. She then put Dr. Milner on hold for the third time. She knew it wouldn't last. He'd wait 5 minutes, hang up, and redial the emergency line, just as he had the last 2 times. She waited the 5 minutes. drumming her fingers on her desk and staring at the switchboard. Lieutenant Pemberton's line was still active. In 8 years as a state police dispatcher, she'd had her share of bad days, but this was the first time she'd been asked to get the governor's home phone number. That was huge and scary. Next to her, Renee was telling the owner of a trucking company that, yes, the state was commandeering his warehouses, and no, there wasn't anything he could do about it. Of course you can call your lawyer, Renee said. Just make sure that neither of you are within 200 yards of the warehouse when you begin your protest. The state of New York thanks you. She hung up and gave Courtney a look. This is so messed up, she said. I can't believe Bill and Porter are dead. And Bauer and Hines and Brown, Courtney added. She had taken the call from Foster when he had finally reported in after his disastrous recon. That had been scary as hell. He'd spoken listlessly in a dull monotone, reading off the names of the dead like he was reading off an order for Chinese takeout. After that, she'd been officially cut out of the loop. Foster had asked to talk to Pemberton. The second she transferred him, Courtney jumped out of her chair, raced down the hall to the station chief's office, and stood outside the door, barely breathing. Pemberton's speakerphone was clear as day, and she heard Foster repeat the same list of the dead in the same washed-out voice. How did you screw this up so badly? Pemberton demanded. I've got 8 men dead. 8? Bauer and Porter and... Fuck! The lieutenant's fury was so elemental that Courtney almost ran back to her place in the dispatch room. Her curiosity was too great, and she stayed. They're not really dead, Foster said quietly. What? You just told me they were torn to pieces. You said they had their throats ripped out. Yeah, but they're not really dead. They'll come back as one of them, and then it won't be so bad. Officially speaking, that is. You'll only have to list them as casualties, not KIA. Pemberton sat back, quiet for half a minute, and the entire time, Courtney thought he was going to go berserk. However, he seemed calm when he said, very slowly, Right, because they're zombies now. Yes, Foster agreed. Okay, Greg. Okay, I don't want you to take offense, but I think we're going to need to authenticate this, to make it official. Let me talk to Trooper Paul. We can send in another... No, Foster said. His tone was low and dangerous. No one else is going in. You wanted me to reconnoiter the building, and I did. You wanted to find out what the fuck was going on in there, and I told you. If you don't believe me, then go on yourself, but you're not sending anyone else in. Pemberton, listen to me. This is real. Greg, please listen to yourself. I can't go to Billups about zombies. You know what he'll say. I need proof. I need an objective observer to go in. That's what I am, Foster cried. I'm your eyewitness, and if you don't believe me, try believing those people trapped in the building. They are trapped by fucking zombies. I shot 8 or 9 of them, and they just kept coming like they didn't feel a thing. They just kept coming and coming, and... Okay, Greg, Pemberton said in a softer tone. I believe you. Just do me a favor and don't use the word zombie in anything official. Courtney had heard enough. She went back to her desk, feeling odd. Her reality had been severely tested, and it had failed. She took Milner's calls, and then between them, told Renee everything. He said zombies? Renee asked. Before Courtney could answer, her call light began blinking. It's that jackass again. He acts like I'm his secretary or something. You want to take it? No, mine's going too. Milner's call was tedious. He demanded to know what was happening and why everything was taking so long and when they'd be rescued. Courtney didn't have much more to tell him besides, we're doing the best we can. Sit tight and a rescue team will get to you soon. She had no idea when soon would occur. Every trooper within 300 miles was racing to Walton, while local police forces were being stripped of their men. She could expect 60 law enforcement officers to be on site by 9 that night. Unfortunately, that didn't mean a rescue was going to happen immediately. After the last fiasco, Courtney didn't think there would be another attempt until the CDC team arrived.
Okay, now I'm going to stipple the background. Now let me show you what I did. You don't see much. And you see a little more. Okay, that's my duck. And so I'm going to stipple the background, and it's not very funny to look at it, and it's noisy, so I don't think you would enjoy it. I will do that on my own, and I will come back later when I'm starting to do the inlay. Until then, take care.